Let's break down 5 players set to go absolutely nuclear here in week 9 of the fantasy season. These are the players with amazing upside, great matchups, and the players that you absolutely need to start if you want to dominate your league mates here in week 9 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick the video off with DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, coming off of a somewhat disappointing week where he had 15.1 fantasy points against the Ravens, 45 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 2 catches for 26 receiving yards. And he was in last week's video. We love that matchup against the Ravens, as they have been one of the worst teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. And I know, once again, he didn't quite have a massive week this past week, but it kind of turned into a game script where the Bears needed to continuously throw the football and just wasn't exactly what we expected. And he was still very solid. And he has been great this year with double-digit fantasy points in every game this year except for week 1, the RB12 in total fantasy points per game, the RB11 in both half and full PPR. And we still look over the last 4 weeks, he's had 16 or more fantasy points in 3 out of 4 matchups. And how can you not start him this week against the Cincinnati Bengals, the very worst team overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position? And they just got absolutely shredded this past week by Breece Hall, who had 32.8 fantasy points, 133 yards on the ground, and 2 rushing touchdowns, not to mention Justin Fields, who had 31 rushing yards against them, and backup running back Isaiah Davis, who had 65 yards on the ground and 5 catches for 44 receiving yards, 17.9 fantasy points for him this past week. So, yeah, we might see some Kyle Monangai involvement in this game, depending on how the game script goes, but we are certainly going to see a lot of DeAndre Swift. And still, for the most part, since the Bears' early bye week, they have come out just, running the football a lot. And I think this is going to be another matchup where they have a high volume in terms of touches to the running back position. And like I said, maybe we get some Monangai this week. We didn't really get a whole lot this past week, but DeAndre Swift is still the clear-cut RB1 here. He is going to get the bulk of the volume and touches, and this is a matchup basically for the rest of the season. We are starting whatever RB1 is playing the Cincinnati Bengals. There is no way whatsoever you can bench DeAndre Swift here in week 9 of the season. He is set to go absolutely nuclear. Next up is Kimani Vidal of the LA Chargers, coming off of a nice week 8 performance on Thursday Night Football against the Vikings, where he had 19.7 fantasy points, 117 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 1 catch for 10 receiving yards. And you gotta love this matchup, even on the road here against the Tennessee Titans. This Titans team as a whole is just slowly falling apart here in the 2025 season, and they are one of the very worst teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. Now, they have played Jonathan Taylor twice this year, and he has absolutely gone crazy against them, and that does impact their ratings here, and they did play Jonathan Taylor this past week, but still, this is a smash spot on the season as a whole. The Titans have been very, very bad against opposing running backs, and really, with the absence of Omari and Hampton, this has become Kimani Vidal's backfield. I know he wasn't great week 7 against the Colts, but Hassan Haskins is dealing with an injury, and in his absence, I mean, it's just been Kimani Vidal and nobody else. He dominated the touches this past week. He's going to dominate the touches for the Chargers once again here in week 9, and this could easily turn into a game script like we saw this past week for the Chargers, where they get up early, the defense is making plays, and then really they're just turning to the run game as the game progresses, and the game script ultimately benefits the running back position. So this is a great spot for Kimani Vidal, who for a majority of you guys, this wasn't a running back you drafted for sure. This is a running back that you got off of the waiver wire, and you may have other options. He could be a flex option for you guys. Maybe you're dealing with bye weeks. He's your RB2, whatever it is. He needs to be in your starting lineup. Game script is great here. The matchup is phenomenal, and he is getting running back 1 volume. Undoubtedly, he will see that here in week 9. Also, this Titans offense turns the football over. There's going to be some short yardage situations for the Chargers offense here in week 9. Kimani Vidal, one of my very favorite running backs to start this week. He could go absolutely nuclear. Make sure he is in your starting lineup if you own him. Moving to a wide receiver, let's talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. The last time we saw him in action was week 7 against the Green Bay Packers, and it wasn't very great. 6 targets, just 2 catches for 58 receiving yards, and he's only hit double-digit fantasy points in 3 games on the season. We don't exactly know at this point in the week if we're going to see Kyler Murray play in this Monday Night Football game against the Cowboys, but it's looking like it's going to be Kyler Murray. It could also be Jacoby Brissett, of course. And I will say, well, Brissett has arguably been better for the overall passing attack of the Cardinals. He has not been great for Marvin Harrison with 7.8 or less fantasy points in each of the 2 starts with Jacoby Brissett at the quarterback position. But you got to take this matchup here if you guys own Marvin Harrison, who I have gotten a lot of questions about already going into week 9, coming off of the bye week, an extra week to prepare, extra week of rest, and now he gets the Dallas Cowboys, who are the very worst team in the NFL against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. We are starting whatever wide receivers play the Cowboys on a week-to-week basis, as they have allowed a total of 15 receiving touchdowns, the worst in the NFL, and the second worst total yardage, only behind the Giants in the NFL. So this is a smash spot. You just have to take the matchup. Primetime game here. I know the quarterback play overall has been a bit shaky in terms of the Cardinals quarterbacks. And like I said, Brissett has actually technically been better in terms of the passing volume and all of that. But if we do get Kyler Murray, I think that could arguably be better for Marvin Harrison, as his better fantasy performances on the season have been with Kyler Murray at quarterback. But either way, just take the matchup here. The Cowboys secondary has been atrocious, and they're dealing with injuries as well. So you got to love this. Absolute smash spot. He should be 100% in your starting lineups as we approach week 9. Next up, let's talk about DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers, coming off of a very solid week 8 performance. 16.5 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 55 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Metcalf now has a touchdown in 5 out of 7 games on the season. He has been the true red zone threat at the wide receiver position for this Pittsburgh Steelers passing attack. He's a top 20 fantasy football wide receiver in both full and half PPR. Technically in half PPR, he is the wide receiver 10, averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game. We've gotten a very safe floor out of Metcalf on the season. We haven't exactly seen an extremely high ceiling, but in week 4, he did hit 23.6 fantasy points. In week 6, 19.5. And I think we could be closer to that mark, if not higher, here in week 9 at home against the Colts. This Colts team is great, head to toe. Don't get me wrong, but I keep talking week in and week out about this Colts secondary and the fact that the Colts are putting up so many points against opposing teams that as the game goes on, whatever team is facing them is forced to throw the football. And ultimately, they're giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers for that reason. Over 1,300 receiving yards allowed on the season. That is 3rd worst behind the last 2 teams we just talked about, with Marvin Harrison just behind the Cowboys and the Giants. And they've given up 10 receiving touchdowns. They are tied with a few teams for the 3rd most receiving touchdowns allowed on the season. So this is a great spot. And the Steelers offense has not been that bad. Their defense hasn't been great, which is probably going to mean that the Colts, who are the best offense in the league, are going to put up points this week, and the Steelers are going to be playing from behind here, forced to throw the football. And I mean, since week 3, Aaron Rodgers has thrown 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game except for 1 game. The passing attack for the Steelers has been pretty solid as of late, and DK Metcalf is the vocal point here. Outside of the tight ends that they use, a little splash of Roman Wilson as of late, and some splashes of Calvin Austin early in the season. It's been all DK Metcalf. He's the bona fide wide receiver 1 here, He's going to see the volume this week. It's a great matchup. I think DK Metcalf, an absolute must-start player here in week 9 of the fantasy season. Last but not least, let's talk about Davante Adams coming out of his bye week. The last time we saw him in action was week 7 in that London matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Had 26.5 fantasy points off of just 5 catches, 8 targets, 5 catches, 35 receiving yards, and scored 3 touchdowns. He now has 6 total touchdowns through 7 games on the year. And yes, we are going to see Puka Nacua more than likely back here in week 9, although I guess technically speaking, he hasn't come off the injury report, but we're expecting Puka Nacua to be back here in week 9, but that doesn't really bother me. We still look at it. Davante Adams, double digits every game this year except for 2. And he still has been a vocal point of this passing attack for the Rams, even with Puka Nacua on the field. Adams is the wide receiver 12 and full PPR, the wide receiver 8.5 PPR, and he's averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game. So I'm not worried about Puka Nacua whatsoever. But I think some of you guys out there who own Adams, I mean, A is coming off the bye, so maybe you have some other options that like you had to consider last week that you're looking at. It is a tough matchup on paper. The Saints have allowed the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and then you might be worried about the return of Puka Nacua. But when we look at it a little bit closer, ultimately, Davante Adams is having a monster season, and he is still, even coming out of the bye week, he is still the wide receiver 1 in total red zone targets with 17 red zone targets on the season. So as the Rams progress down the field, even if they are utilizing a lot of Puka Nacua, even if Puka Nacua has a game where he finds the end zone, Davante Adams is still going to get red zone targets, is going to be utilized close to the goal line, and ultimately this passing attack for the Rams, this Sean McVay system, is one that you can always trust on a week in, week out basis. Matthew Stafford, 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game this year except for 2. So listen, the Saints defense has not been that bad against opposing quarterbacks. They're not great. 18th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed. It's not the worst, but it's certainly not the greatest ranking there. It's good enough here. I do believe that the Rams will come out here and have some success. One thing about, this coaching staff, Sean McVay, when they have an extra week to prepare, they're at home. Coming out of the bye week, you got to expect they're going to come out here and have some offensive firepower. So whether we get Puka Nacua back this week or not, I think Davante Adams still in a very good spot. If you guys own Davante Adams, make sure he is in your starting lineups. The floor is very safe, but once again, I think that the upside is still there. He's an absolute must-start player here in Week 9 of the fantasy season. And there you guys have it. There are my 5 players set to go absolutely nuclear here in Week 5 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below, so please drop me any fantasy questions that you have. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it helps me out tremendously, helps out the channel even more when you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the playlists and videos pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our Week 9 fantasy content. We have everything here on the channel that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.